The year is 1936. The sun over California's Central Valley is not a gentle star, but a white-hot anvil beating down upon the parched earth. Dust, fine as powdered bone, coats everything: the drooping leaves of the peach trees, the sweat-stained collars of the workers, and the weary spirit of the nation itself. In the heart of this sprawling orchard stands Kenjiro Takahashi, a man who moves with a quiet deliberation that seems to defy the desperate urgency of the Great Depression. His hands, though calloused and etched with the lines of hard labor, move with the grace of an artisan, cradling each peach as if it were a fragile piece of porcelain. The air is thick with the scent of ripening fruit and the low, droning buzz of cicadas, a sound that serves as the metronome for a day of relentless, back-breaking work. Before we follow this man into the heart of his day, his silent struggle against a world that misunderstands him, we want to feel the reach of his story. It is a tale of quiet resilience that echoes in every corner of the globe where a stranger has tried to make a home. We would be honored to know from which part of the world you are listening to us. Please take a moment to write in the comments the city and country from which you are joining us, so we may all feel connected in this shared human experience. Your presence here gives meaning to the telling of histories that might otherwise be forgotten in the dust. The work is a chaotic ballet of brute force. Around Kenjiro, men from Oklahoma, their faces hardened by loss, attack the trees with a frantic energy, ripping the fruit from the branches. The sound of peaches thudding into wooden crates is a constant, percussive reminder of the waste. For every 10 peaches picked, at least 2 are bruised beyond saving, a casualty of speed. Kenjiro, however, operates within his own sphere of calm. He does not pull, he twists, a slight, practiced rotation of the wrist that releases the stem without tearing the delicate skin. He places each one in his basket with a reverence that borders on prayer, honoring the life of the tree and the promise of the harvest. He is slower than the others, a fact that does not go unnoticed. Gus, the foreman, a man whose frame is as broad and unyielding as a barn door, watches Kenjiro from the end of a row. A smirk plays on his lips, a mixture of pity and contempt. He sees the Japanese man's meticulousness not as a virtue, but as a weakness, a foolish fussiness, in a world that only rewards speed and volume. He spits a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, a small act of dismissal that speaks louder than any insult. To Gus and the other workers, whose camaraderie is built on loud jokes and shared hardship, Kenjiro's silence is unnerving. They interpret his focus as arrogance, his discipline as a quiet judgment upon their own rough methods, and they answer it with a steady, low-level ridicule that follows him like a shadow. Even the orchard's owner, Mr. Davies, a man worn down by the anxieties of the era, sees Kenjiro as little more than a peculiar but reliable cog in his machine. He walks the lines, his ledger book in hand, his gaze fixed on the quantity of crates being filled, not the quality of the fruit within them. He registers Kenjiro's methodical pace with a curt nod, acknowledging the diligence, but missing the intelligence behind it entirely. To him, Kenjiro is simply the Japanese worker, efficient in his own strange way, but his ideas about waste and process are dismissed as impractical fantasies. The gulf between them is not one of language, but of philosophy. The American pragmatism of more faster clashing with the Japanese principle of mottainai, the sacred aversion to waste. As the oppressive sun finally bleeds into the western horizon, painting the sky in hues of bruised orange and purple, the exhausted workers trudge back towards the bunkhouses. Kenjiro remains for a moment, his silhouette a stark, solitary figure against the fading light. He looks over the rows of trees, his expression unreadable but for the deep-seated resolve in his eyes. He is an island of quiet purpose in an ocean of weary resignation. The day had been like any other, filled with the familiar weight of labor and the sting of unspoken contempt. But what he did not know, as he finally turned to leave the silent orchard behind, was that the dawn of the next day would bring with it a challenge that would forever alter his fate. The journey from the orchard to the small, wooden shack he called home was a pilgrimage through dust. Each step Kenjiro took was deliberate, a conscious shedding of the day's indignities. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows that danced like weary spirits between the rows of trees. The air, finally cooling, carried the scent of dry earth and the distant sound of laughter from the main bunkhouse, a world away from his own quiet threshold. As he approached, the soft yellow glow of a kerosene lamp bloomed in the single window, a beacon in the encroaching twilight. Inside, his wife Hannah moved with a silent grace that mirrored his own. She did not need to speak. Her presence was a balm, the order she maintained in their sparse home, a silent rebuttal to the chaos of the world outside. The creak of the door was the only announcement of his arrival, met not with words, but with the comforting sight of a bowl of hot water waiting for him. The evening ritual was as immutable as the rising sun. Kenjiro would first submerge his hands in the warm water, the steam rising to meet his tired face. The camera would focus on this act not as simple washing but as a purification. He scrubbed away the grit of the fields, the sticky residue of peach fuzz, and the invisible stain of the foreman's contempt. These were not the hands of a mere laborer. They were the hands of an artisan, heirs to a legacy forged in a small village outside of Okayama. The narrator's voice would speak of his father, a master craftsman who made farming tools so perfectly balanced they felt like extensions of the user's own will. He had taught Kenjiro that honor, meiyo, was not found in grand gestures, but in the relentless pursuit of perfection in small things. The promise Kenjiro made to his dying father echoed in the quiet shack. He would never shame their name with mediocre work, no matter how humble the task. The following dawn, before the sky had even decided on a color, Hana was already awake, her movements a soft whisper in the stillness. The focus is on the preparation of the bento box. To an outsider, it was a simple lunch. To Kenjiro, it was a daily testament of faith. Each component was placed with geometric precision. The tightly packed rice, a small piece of salted fish, pickled vegetables arranged like jewels. It was a miniature landscape of order and care, a portable piece of home that he would carry into the fray. This small, lacquered box was Hana's silent contribution to his struggle. It was her way of reminding him who he was, where he came from, and that in this one small corner of his life, harmony and beauty still reigned. It was a shield forged of love and tradition, a quiet act of defiance against a world that valued only crude, hurried output. As Kenjiro walked towards the orchard, the rising sun filtering through the leaves cast a dappled light on the path, stirring a memory. The narrator guides us back to a different light, the smoky, humid air of his father's workshop in Japan. The rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel, the sharp, clean scent of cedar shavings, the focused silence of two men lost in their craft. We see his father's hands, strong and sure, guiding a younger Kenjiro's grip on a plane, teaching him to feel the grain of the wood, to listen to its story before making a cut. Waste is a sin against the spirit of the thing, his father's voice would echo, not in dialogue but in the fabric of the memory itself. The tree gives its life, the metal gives its strength. To treat them carelessly is to dishonor their gift. This principle of motenai, the deep-seated aversion to waste, was the most profound inheritance his father had left him. The memory dissolved as the present reality crashed back in a wave of noise and motion. The orchard was already a hive of frantic activity. The other workers, fueled by a desperate energy, attacked the trees, their movements jerky and aggressive. The sound was a discordant symphony of shouts, branches snapping, and the dull thud of bruised fruit hitting the bottom of wooden crates. Kenjiro's gaze fell upon a peach lying half-crushed in the dust, its sweet flesh already attracting flies. A flicker of pain, sharp and personal, crossed his face. To him, this was not just a piece of spoiled fruit. It was a testament to a profound failure of spirit. It was the physical manifestation of the carelessness his father had taught him to abhor, a deep disrespect for the labor of the earth and the hands that tended it. He felt the chasm between his world and theirs widen with every fallen peach. That night, the kerosene lantern in his shed burned long after the rest of the camp had fallen into an exhausted slumber. Kenjiro was not sleeping. He sat on an overturned crate, his eyes scanning the discarded objects piled in the corner. Splinters of wood from broken boxes, a rusted bicycle chain, a warped sheet of tin roofing. To others, it was a pile of refuse. To Kenjiro, it was a collection of possibilities. He picked up a smooth, flat stone and, with the focus of a monk in meditation, began to etch lines into the packed dirt floor. He was not drawing a machine, he was mapping a current, a gentle, flowing path. The narrator would explain that Kenjiro was not trying to invent something new, but to reassemble an old wisdom, the way water could be guided to carry, to clean, to sort without bruising. He was seeking harmony, not force. The next morning, a new notice was nailed to the door of the packing shed, written in Mr. Davies's sharp, impatient script. It announced a cash bonus to be paid at the end of the week to the crew that harvested the most crates. A wave of competitive fervor washed over the workers. Gus, the foreman, read the notice, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He turned and looked directly at Kenjiro, who was standing at the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable. Gus's look was a challenge, a declaration that in this world, brute speed would always triumph over meticulous care. The pressure on Kenjiro, already immense, had just been magnified tenfold. But what no one knew, least of all Mr. Davies, was that this desperate push for quantity would soon unleash a crisis of waste so severe that it would force everyone to look for a solution, even in the most unlikely of places. The new bonus system transformed the orchard into a battlefield. The air, once filled with the steady rhythm of labor, now crackled with a frantic, competitive energy. Men shouted and cursed, tearing through the branches with a reckless abandon that sent a rain of leaves and twigs to the ground. The sound of snapping wood became as common as the thud of peaches being dumped into crates. Kenjiro tried to maintain his own sphere of calm, his movements still deliberate and respectful, but the chaos pressed in on him. He could feel the foreman's eyes on him constantly, a predatory gaze waiting for him to break, to hurry, to finally succumb to their brute force philosophy. The waste was staggering. For every crate filled in this mad dash, another half crate's worth of bruised, unsalvageable fruit was left trampled in the dust, a silent testament to the cost of greed. During a brief midday break, Kenjiro approached Mr. Davies, holding a small, intricately carved model of a wooden trough he had whittled from a piece of scrap. In his careful, deliberate English, he tried to explain his idea. A simple channel where a gentle current of water could carry, clean and sort the peaches without the rough handling that caused so much damage. Mr. Davies, his face a mask of stress as he tallied figures in his ledger, barely glanced at the model. He clapped Kenjiro on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be reassuring but felt deeply dismissive. "That's clever, Kenjiro, real clever. But right now, I just need crates filled. Speed is all that matters." He walked away, leaving Kenjiro standing alone in the oppressive heat, the small, hopeful model in his hands, suddenly feeling fragile and foolish, a relic from another world. The dismissal from the owner emboldened the others. The subtle mockery that had followed Kenjiro like a shadow now stepped into the open. As the men gathered around the water barrel, Gus, the foreman, picked up a fallen peach with an exaggerated delicacy, mimicking Kenjiro's precise movements. He held it to his ear, as if listening for a secret, then bowed to it. "Oh, Honorable Mr. Peach, please allow me to place you gently in the basket," he drawled in a high-pitched voice. The surrounding men erupted in harsh, braying laughter. Kenjiro stood apart, methodically refilling his canteen, his expression a placid mask. He did not grant them the satisfaction of a reaction, but inside, the fire of Haji, a deep, personal shame, burned. He was not just being mocked. The legacy of his father, the very core of his identity, was being turned into a joke. That night, the kerosene lantern in his shed became a solitary star against the vast, dark canvas of the sleeping camp. He began to build, his only companions the scavenged materials he had collected. The camera would lovingly trace the textures of his effort, the rough grain of splintered crate wood, the cold rusted surface of a bicycle chain, the warped ripples of a sheet of tin. The work was clumsy, a frustrating battle against imperfect materials. As he tried to bend a stubborn piece of wood into a curve, it split with a sharp crack, driving a long splinter deep into the palm of his hand. He winced, pulling it out with his teeth, and watched as a single drop of his blood fell onto the dirt floor sketch, smudging the careful lines. It felt like an omen, a sign that this creation, born of desperation and scrap, was flawed from its very inception. For several nights, the lonely sound of his hammering and sawing became a quiet rebellion against the camp's exhausted slumber. Hannah would stand in the doorway of their shack, her silhouette framed by the dim light from within, a silent vigil of worry and faith. She would bring him a cup of hot tea, her presence a brief, wordless comfort before she retreated, leaving him to his solitary labor. The other workers on their way to the latrine would slow their pace, whispering and pointing at the strange skeletal contraption taking shape in the flickering lantern light. Kenjiro's folly, one of them called it, and the name stuck, passed around in sneering whispers. The Japanese contraption became the official term for his desperate hope, a name that was both a racial slur and a preemptive judgment of his failure. The day of the first test arrived under a sky the color of slate. He had managed to divert a small trickle of water from an irrigation ditch. Gus and a handful of other workers gathered, their arms crossed, smirks already fixed on their faces, ready to witness the spectacular failure they had all predicted. With a deep breath that did little to calm the tremor in his hands, Kenjiro cranked the handle. The bicycle chain groaned, and the wooden rollers began to turn. A younger worker, more curious than cruel, hesitantly poured a bucket of peaches into the trough. The result was immediate and catastrophic. The mechanism jammed, the rollers tore the delicate skin of the fruit, and water, leaking from every poorly sealed joint, turned the ground into a soupy, pathetic mud. The peaches piled up, a mangled, bruised heap. Gus's laughter boomed across the yard. "Congratulations, Takahashi. You've invented a peach grinder." A profound silence fell over Kenjiro as he stared at the ruin of his efforts. The muddy water, the bleeding fruit, the merciless, jeering faces of the men, it all coalesced into a single crushing tableau of public humiliation. He looked down at his own hands, caked in mud and sticky pulp, and for the first time in his life, they felt alien to him. These were not the hands of a craftsman, the inheritors of his father's skill. They were the clumsy, inept hands of a fool who had dared to dream beyond his station. The weight of his promise, to never bring shame upon their name, crashed down on him. He had not only failed to prove his worth, he had confirmed every suspicion they had about him, turning his heritage into a spectacle of incompetence. Without a word, he turned his back on the broken machine and the echoing laughter. He walked past his shack, past Hannah's worried face in the window, and into the deep, silent rows of the orchard. The trees, which had always felt like stoic companions, now seemed like silent, accusing judges. The moon filtered through the leaves, casting a pale, skeletal light on the ground. He finally sank down, his back pressing against the rough bark of a peach tree, the very source of his toil and his shame. He closed his eyes, the sound of Gus's mockery replaying in his mind like a broken record. In the vast, lonely quiet of the California night, Kenjiro felt a defeat so total it hollowed him out. But what he did not know, as he sat there in his despair, was that the very air around him was changing, growing heavy with a sudden, suffocating heat that would soon force everyone's hand. The rain began that night, a soft, hesitant patter that seemed to mourn with him. Kenjiro returned to the shack not as a man returning from a day of labor, but as a soldier retreating from a lost battle. He moved through the familiar space as if it were a stranger's home, his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight, far heavier than any crate of peaches. Hannah met him at the door, her eyes asking the questions her voice would not. She had prepared his dinner, a small steaming bowl of rice and vegetables, but he simply shook his head and sat on the edge of their thin mattress. The sound of the rain grew stronger, a steady, insistent drumming on the tin roof that filled the silence he could not. He stared at the floorboards, seeing not the wood grain, but the muddy, ruined pulp of the peaches, a perfect metaphor for his own crushed hopes. After an hour of sitting in this heavy stillness, he rose and moved to a small wooden chest tucked away in a corner. The creak of its lid was a sharp, lonely sound in the quiet room. From within, he carefully lifted a small bundle wrapped in silk cloth. Unfolding it revealed a stack of letters, their paper thin and brittle with age, covered in the elegant, flowing calligraphy of his father. He didn't need to read them. He knew their contents by heart. They spoke of discipline, of the honor found in perfecting one's craft, of the sacred duty to never waste the gifts of nature or the efforts of one's ancestors. The camera would focus on his calloused thumb, gently tracing the character for "May your honor." The word, once a source of strength, now felt like a searing brand, a constant reminder of the promise he had so publicly broken. His gaze drifted to his own hands, resting uselessly in his lap. They were raw from the splinter, stained with dirt and the memory of failure. He saw them as alien things, clumsy and coarse, unworthy of the legacy they were supposed to carry. The vivid memory of his father's workshop flooded his mind, a painful contrast to his current reality. He could almost smell the sharp scent of cedar wood and hot steel, feel the perfect, reassuring weight of a hand-forged chisel, and hear the quiet, confident rhythm of his father's hammer. That world was one of precision, purpose, and profound respect. This world was one of mud, mockery, and brute force. He had tried to bridge the two and had fallen into the chasm between them, shaming the very memory he sought to honor with every clumsy attempt. The rain became a downpour, a relentless cascade of water that seemed determined to wash the world away. Through the thin walls, he could hear the distant, muffled sound of laughter from the main bunkhouse, a stark reminder of his isolation. He looked at Hannah, who sat mending one of his work shirts by the dim lantern light, her needle moving with a steady, practiced rhythm. Her silence was not an accusation, but a testament to her unwavering faith, which made his failure feel even more profound. She had created a small island of order and dignity for them in this sea of chaos, and he had allowed the mockery of the outside world to breach its shores. The shame he felt was no longer just his own. It was a heavy blanket he had thrown over them both, suffocating the quiet pride they had so carefully preserved. His fingers found a small, smooth river stone he kept on the simple wooden sill, a memento from the stream that ran behind his childhood home in Okayama. He closed his hand around it, its cool, solid presence a small anchor in the swirling tide of his emotions. The narrator would speak of the stone's journey, how its perfect smoothness was not the result of a single violent act, but of centuries of patient, constant abrasion by the gentle current. It was shaped by persistence, not by force. As Kenjiro rolled the stone over and over in his palm, a subtle change occurred in his expression. The deep lines of despair around his eyes did not disappear, but they hardened, solidifying into a quiet, unyielding resolve. The frantic need for validation, the sting of public failure, it all began to recede. As the first hint of a grey, watery dawn broke through the clouds, Kenjiro stood up. He walked to the doorway and looked out at the drenched, sleeping camp. The decision settled within him, not with a flash of insight, but with the quiet finality of a stone settling at the bottom of a river. He would know, longer seek to explain his vision. He would not ask for permission or approval. The humiliation had come from seeking recognition from men who could never understand his philosophy. From this day forward, his work would be his only voice. He would rebuild his creation in silence for himself, to prove the principle not to them, but to the spirit of his father. He would become a force of nature, as quiet and persistent as the water that shaped the stone. But what he did not know, as he breathed in the cold, damp air, was that the very rain that had mirrored his despair was about to trigger a crisis that would give his silent resolve a stage. The rain had washed the dust from the air, leaving the world clean and sharp in the cool morning light. Kenjiro stood before the wreck of his machine, the monument to his public failure. The mud had dried, cracking around the bruised peaches that were already beginning to rot. But as he surveyed the scene, the hot sting of shame was gone, replaced by a cold, clear-eyed analysis. He was no longer a performer seeking applause, but a craftsman examining a flawed piece of work. The jeers of the crowd had, in a strange way, liberated him. He no longer needed their approval. His new audience was the spirit of his father, and his only goal was to honor the principle they both held sacred. He knelt, his fingers tracing the warped wood and the jammed chain, not with despair but with the diagnostic touch of a master seeking the root of the error. He abandoned the shed for a time, his focus shifting from construction to observation. During his brief breaks from the fields, he would sit by the main irrigation ditch, a place no one else bothered with. He watched the steady, patient current of the water, how it flowed effortlessly around rocks, carrying leaves and fallen blossoms on its surface without tearing their delicate structures. The camera would capture these moments in intimate detail, a single leaf spinning slowly in an eddy, a smooth stone parting the water without a splash. The narrator's voice would explain that Kenjiro was relearning a lesson he had forgotten in his desperation. He had tried to command the water to force it through a machine. He now understood he had to listen to it, to learn its language of gentle persuasion and build a path that invited its cooperation. The sketches in the dirt floor of his shed were wiped away. In their place, new designs appeared, drawn with a stick in the dim lantern light. The straight lines and sharp angles of a machine were gone, replaced by the graceful, flowing curves of a riverbed. He was no longer thinking in terms of gears and force, but of slopes, channels, and currents. His scavenger hunts became more purposeful. He sought out old canvas sacks not for their durability, but for their softness when wet. He found discarded inner tubes, realizing their pliable rubber could create gentle bumpers. He was not rebuilding his contraption. He was creating an entirely new organism, a system designed to cradle and guide, not to process and push. It was a physical manifestation of a philosophy, an argument made of wood, canvas, and tin. His nightly labor resumed, a quiet counterpoint to the exhausted snores of the camp. The jarring sounds of hammering were replaced by the soft rasp of a handsaw, the rhythmic scrape of sandpaper on wood, the careful stretching of wet canvas over a frame. The other workers, passing by in the dark, would still slow their pace, but their whispers were no longer of mockery. They were tinged with a grudging, confused respect for his sheer, stubborn persistence. Hana would bring him his tea each night, her presence a silent affirmation. She saw the change in his posture, the calm efficiency of his movements. The frantic, desperate energy was gone, replaced by the deep, steady focus of a man who had found his true north again, not in the eyes of others but within himself. One night, under the solitary glow of the lantern, he conducted a test. There was no audience, no expectation, only the quiet pursuit of truth. He poured a single bucket of water into the head of the new, curving trough. Then he took a handful of the ripest, most delicate peaches, the kind that would bruise if you looked at them too hard, and gently placed them into the shallow, flowing current. The camera followed a single peach on its journey. It floated serenely, nudged along by the water, rolling softly over the canvas-lined guides, bumping gently against the rubber buffers, and arriving at the collection basin. At the other end, clean, gleaming, and utterly perfect. Kenjiro picked it up, turning it over in his palm. A slow, profound satisfaction settled on his features. The principle was true. The following day, the air grew thick and heavy. The relentless blue sky of the valley was veiled by a high, milky haze that trapped the heat, turning the orchard into a convection oven. The leaves on the peach trees, usually a vibrant green, seemed to hang limp and tired, their color muted by a fine layer of ever-present dust. The older men, the Dust Bowl migrants who knew the cruel whims of this land, would stop their work, wipe the sweat from their brows, and stare uneasily at the eastern horizon. They spoke in low tones of the devil winds, the hot, dry gusts that could sweep down from the mountains and ripen an entire orchard in a single suffocating afternoon, turning a season's hard labor into a field of unsalvageable, rotting pulp. As the day wore on, a palpable tension settled over the orchard, heavier than the heat itself. Mr. Davies paced the rows, his ledger forgotten in his back pocket. He would pick a peach, his thumb pressing into its flesh, feeling a softness that should have been weeks away. The frantic pace of the bonus week seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a much more primal fear, the fear of total loss. Meanwhile, in his shed, Kenjiro remained absorbed in his work, making the final minute adjustments to his creation. He was a man tuning a fine instrument, oblivious to the approaching storm. He was preparing his quiet answer to a question the world had not yet asked, unaware that a force of nature was about to scream that question across the entire valley, demanding a solution he alone possessed. The devil wines arrived not with a roar but as a suffocating whisper. A wave of dry, searing heat rolled down from the mountains, baking the valley and turning the orchard into a kiln. The peaches, days away from their peak, began to ripen all at once, their flesh softening into a delicate state that bordered on decay. Panic, a scent as sharp as the overripe fruit itself, spread through the workers. Mr. Davies, his face a mask of grim desperation, marched through the rows, his boots crushing fallen fruit into a sweet, sticky mud. He stopped before a mountain of crates already deemed too soft for the rough hands of the sorters. With nothing left to lose, he turned, his eyes finding the one man who had been a quiet problem. "Takahashi," he barked, his voice cracking. "Your machine! Now!" The crowd of exhausted workers turned as one, their faces a mixture of dread and a cruel, final curiosity. Kenjiro moved through the parting crowd as if walking through water. The oppressive heat, the scent of ruin, the dozens of watching eyes. He registered them all, but they did not touch the core of stillness within him. His focus was absolute. He approached his creation not as a desperate gamble, but as a final, quiet statement of fact. His hands, steady and unhurried, moved with a ritualistic grace. He checked the tension of the bicycle chain, ran his palm over the smooth, canvas-lined channel, and opened the small wooden gate that allowed a controlled stream of water from the irrigation ditch to enter. The sound was a gentle gurgle, a liquid murmur of life in the parched air. He was not a mechanic starting an engine. He was a monk coaxing a prayer from wood, tin and water, preparing an altar for a harvest that everyone else had already abandoned as lost. With a final, centering breath, Kenjiro placed his hand on the wooden crank and began to turn. The crowd held its breath, braced for the familiar, catastrophic sound of grinding metal and splintering wood. Instead, a low, consistent hum rose into the thick air, a sound so unexpectedly gentle it was almost melodic. The water flowed in a perfect, shallow current. Gus, at a nod from Davies, motioned to two younger men. With cynical grunts, they heaved a crate of the softest, most vulnerable peaches into the receiving basin. A collective gasp went through the onlookers as the fruit hit the water. They leaned forward, their bodies tensing, waiting for the machine to tear and mangle the delicate flesh, to produce the pathetic, pulpy mess that would confirm their judgment and put an end to this foolishness once and for all. But the expected destruction never came. The camera follows a single, blush-colored peach on its journey. It is lifted by the current, floating serenely down the curved path. It bumps softly against a bumper made from a discarded inner tube, rolls gently over a canvas-covered cylinder that separates it from leaves and is bathed by the clean, flowing water. It is a graceful, silent ballet of applied wisdom. One by one, then in a steady, unbroken stream, the peaches emerged at the other end, gleaming, whole and perfect. They slid gently down a final ramp into an empty crate, landing not with a damaging thud, but with a soft, continuous whisper, like the sound of ripe fruit being placed carefully into a basket by hand. The machine was not just sorting, it was honoring the fruit. The first crate filled with flawless peaches, then a second and a third. The mountain of condemned fruit shrank with a speed that seemed impossible, processed with a gentleness no human hand could consistently replicate. A profound, stunned silence fell over the yard, broken only by the quiet hum of the machine and the soft cascade of the harvest being saved. The workers stood frozen, their mockery forgotten, their skepticism vaporized by the undeniable truth before them. Gus, his face stripped of its sneer, stepped forward as if in a trance. He reached into a full crate, picked up a single peach, and turned it over in his calloused hands. He examined its unblemished skin with the focused awe of a man seeing something he had been told could not exist. Mr. Davies walked slowly to where Kenjiro stood by the crank. The owner's face was pale, his eyes wide with the dawning realization of what he was witnessing, not just the salvation of a crop, but the birth of a new philosophy. He did not offer a loud congratulations or a slap on the back. He simply looked from the humming machine to the quiet man who built it, and in that look was a depth of respect that Kenjiro had never seen. Davies then turned to the mesmerized crowd. "Get the rest of the harvest," he ordered, his voice low and steady. All of it. Run it through. Through this. He had no name for it. It was no longer Kenjiro's folly. It was simply the answer. The command was an abdication of the old ways, a public anointing of the new. As the men broke their trance and began moving with a new, sober purpose, Kenjiro stepped away from the machine. His part was done. He watched them for a moment, then leaned the wooden hand crank, its surface polished smooth by his persistence, against the frame of his creation. The camera holds on this final symbolic image, the resting tool, the humming heart of the system, and the steady golden river of rescued peaches. The sun, which had been their enemy all day, now broke through the haze, casting a warm, validating light over the scene. The air no longer smelled of decay, but of sweet success. The true harvest, born of silent dedication in the face of relentless doubt, had finally been brought in. The weeks that followed the devil winds were marked not by a revolution, but by a profound and quiet evolution. The packing shed, once a place of chaotic noise and waste, now operated with the serene hum of Kenjiro's creation at its heart. The men worked differently, their movements more deliberate, their voices lower. Gus, the foreman, no longer stood with his arms crossed in judgment. Instead, he watched the flow of peaches with a focused intensity, occasionally asking Kenjiro a quiet question about adjusting the water flow, his tone stripped of its old cruelty and filled with a raw, grudging respect. Mr. Davies would often stand at a distance, his ledger book now used to sketch improvements, not just tally losses. The air itself felt different, cleansed of the frantic desperation, and now filled with the clean scent of saved fruit and the quiet dignity of work done well. Kenjiro's new role was not that of a manager, but of a sensei. He spent his afternoons not shouting orders, but standing beside the younger workers, the ones whose eyes held curiosity instead of contempt. He would guide their hands, not to show them how to crank the handle, but to have them feel the grain of a wooden crate before nailing it shut, to understand its potential to split. He taught them to listen to the sound of the water, to recognize the subtle shift in its murmur that signaled a blockage. He was not teaching them to operate a machine. He was teaching them to see the world as he did, as a system of interconnected parts, where waste was a failure of observation and respect was the most efficient tool of all. His legacy was not being built of tin and wood, but was being planted in the minds of a new generation. One evening, as the last rays of the sun painted the dusty valley in shades of amber and gold, Kenjiro stood alone, watching the now silent packing shed. The air was cool, carrying the sweet scent of the earth. Hana appeared at his side, a silent presence as always, and handed him a steaming cup of green tea. He accepted it, his gaze falling upon his own hands, cradling the warm ceramic. They were still calloused, still etched with the lines of hard labor, but they no longer felt alien. They were his father's hands, his own hands, the hands of a craftsman. He looked out at the rows of trees, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze, and spoke in a voice so low it was almost part of the evening air. "The real harvest," he said softly to Hana, "wasn't in the crates of peaches, but in the respect that finally grew from this dusty soil." Kenjiro's story does not end here, for a legacy is not a destination, but a current that flows onward. The machine he built from scrap and shame would be copied and improved upon, changing the face of agriculture in the valley. But the true invention was the quiet principle he defended, that a person's worth is measured not by the noise they make, but by the harmony they create. The noise of disbelief is always loud, but the sound of good work, of quiet honor, echoes for generations, a testament to the unshakable power of a single, persistent spirit. If this story of silent strength has moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel and giving this video a like. It is through sharing these histories that we keep the lamps of their legacies burning brightly for all to see.